HOA fined me over my yacht, so I bought the lake and kicked everyone out. You heard that right, they fined me for keeping my own yacht at my own dock. But what the HOA didn't know is that I was about to turn the entire neighborhood upside down. It started with a simple letter in my mailbox. Then the threats got louder. Then the police showed up at my dock. And that's when I made the boldest move of my life. A move so shocking that today, the HOA can't even step foot on the lake they once controlled. Long pause. And trust me, you won't believe how it all ended. Welcome back, folks, to HOA Max Stories, where we share the most unbelievable battles between homeowners and HOAs. My name's John. I live in a quiet lakeside community here in the United States, and I've spent years dealing with HOA drama you wouldn't believe. But today's story, well, it's one for the history books. Before we dive in, if you enjoy these wild HOA tales, do me a small favor. Hit that subscribe button, think of it like waving to your neighbor across the street. Doesn't cost you a thing, but it sure means a lot to me. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from today? I love knowing which part of the country, or even the world, you're tuning in from. I was standing on my dock that morning, coffee in my hand, watching the sun rise over the calm lake. It was one of those quiet mornings that remind you why you work your whole life, why you save, why you dream. My yacht was right there, tied to the dock, shining in the golden light. To me, it wasn't just a boat. It was a reward. My children had moved out, I had worked through sleepless nights and long years, and finally, I had something that felt like freedom. Sitting on that yacht with my wife in the evenings, watching the water ripple, that was peace. But peace doesn't last long when you live under an HOA. I heard the mail truck stop by, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. I walked up, opened my mailbox, and there it was, a plain white envelope. No stamp, no friendly handwriting, just that bold HOA letterhead staring back at me. I opened it right there. And what I read made my hands shake with anger. Violation notice. Your yacht is a community disturbance. Fine, $5,000. Remove your vessel within 7 days. I almost laughed, at first. I thought, maybe this is a mistake. Surely they don't have the right to tell me I can't keep my own yacht on my own dock. But as I read the fine print, it hit me. They were serious. I walked back to my dock, letter still in hand, and stared at my yacht. An eyesore? That's what they called it? No. This wasn't about the yacht. This was about control. I crumpled the letter and tossed it into the trash. But little did I know, that was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to voices outside. I peeked through my window. 2 HOA board members stood on the dock, pointing at my yacht, taking pictures. One of them, the president, had his arms crossed and his jaw tight like he was ready for a fight. I opened my window and called out, "Can I help you?" He didn't even turn his head. He just said, "That boat doesn't belong here. Remove it, or pay the fine." I felt my blood boil. I wanted to yell, but instead, I stayed calm. "It's my dock," I said. "My property. My money. My yacht. You don't get to decide this." But he only smiled. That smug HOA smile. "We'll see about that." And they left. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying it in my head. The arrogance. The way they spoke to me like I was a child. Like I hadn't worked 40 years for everything I owned. I kept hearing the words, "We'll see about that." The next day, another letter came. This time, the fine had doubled. $10,000. They were playing games now, pushing, testing, waiting for me to break. But I wasn't about to bend. I told myself, no, not this time. I won't be bullied by a group of neighbors who think a title gives them power over me. So I ignored it. And that's when things escalated. 3 days later, I was on my dock cleaning the deck of my yacht when I heard sirens. I turned my head and saw flashing lights coming down my street. 2 police cruisers. My stomach dropped. For a moment, I thought, no, it can't be. But as they pulled up, the HOA president was standing there with his arms crossed again, this time smirking like he had just won. The officers walked up to me. "Sir, we got a call about a disturbance. HOA says you're violating neighborhood rules. We're here to check things out." I looked at them, then at the president, then back at my yacht. A disturbance? My boat wasn't blasting music. It wasn't sinking. It wasn't blocking anyone. It was just sitting there. "This is harassment," I said. "That yacht is mine. This dock is mine. And last I checked, the HOA doesn't own the water." The officers didn't say much. They just looked around, then told me to work it out with the board. And just like that, they left. But the damage was done. The HOA had crossed a line. Now it wasn't just about a fine. It wasn't about a boat. It was about my dignity. My freedom. My right to live without being bullied in my own home. That night, as I sat on the edge of the dock, watching the moonlight reflect on the water, I made a decision. A decision so bold, so outrageous, that if you had told me a year earlier I would even think about it. I would have laughed in your face. But that night, it didn't feel crazy. It felt right. Because if the HOA wanted to fight me over the lake, I would take the lake away from them. That's when the plan began forming. Calls to lawyers. Research into property records. And one shocking discovery that changed everything. The HOA didn't actually own the lake. And if I wanted to, I could. I leaned back, staring at the stars, and smiled for the first time in weeks. This wasn't over. In fact, it was just getting started. And before I continue with what happened next, let me ask you something. If your HOA tried to fine you thousands of dollars for something you owned, something you loved, would you fight back, or would you give in? Tell me down in the comments, I really want to hear your story. I woke up the next morning with a new fire in me, the kind of fire you get when you realize you've been pushed too far. The HOA thought they had me cornered. They thought a few fines and a couple of police calls would scare me into submission. But they didn't know me. I wasn't raised to give in. I wasn't raised to let bullies win. So I called a lawyer. I sat down in his office, handed him the violation letters, and told him the whole story. He read them carefully, his eyebrows lifting higher with every page. Finally, he looked up and said, "They don't have the power they think they do. Let me dig into this." 2 days later, he called me back. His voice had that little spark in it, the kind you hear when someone has just discovered something unbelievable. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "The HOA doesn't own the lake." I blinked. "What do you mean? They act like they own it." "No," he said. "The lake is privately owned by a company. And guess what? That company is willing to sell." I sat there in silence, the words echoing in my head. Willing to sell. That night, I went back to the dock. I sat on the deck of my yacht, staring out over the water. The same water the HOA thought they controlled. The same water they threatened me over. And all I could think was, what if? What if I didn't just fight the HOA? What if I ended them? The thought seemed ridiculous at first. Buying a lake? Who does that? But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I had the money. I had the motivation. And most importantly, I had nothing left to lose. So I started the process. It wasn't easy. Paperwork. Contracts. Negotiations. Meetings with lawyers and the property company. For weeks, I was in and out of offices, signing documents, reviewing numbers, making calls late into the night. Meanwhile, the HOA didn't slow down. They sent more fines. They doubled them again. $20,000. $30,000. They even sent me threats of legal action. One day, I found a bright red notice taped to my front door, final warning. Remove yacht or face court. I ripped it down and laughed. If only they knew. Because while they were busy trying to bury me in paperwork and threats, I was busy buying the ground right out from under them. And then, it happened. I signed the final papers. With one signature, the lake changed hands. It was no longer a tool for the HOA's control. It was mine. Every inch of it. From the shallow edges near the houses to the deep center where kids swam in the summer. All of it. And the first thing I did was pour myself a drink, sit back on my yacht, and look out at the water with the biggest smile I'd had in years. I thought about every letter. Every fine. Every smug look from the HOA president. And I couldn't wait to see his face when he found out. The very next HOA meeting, I walked in holding the deed. They didn't want me there. In fact, the president tried to shut me down before I could even speak. But I placed the papers right there on the table. I own the lake now, I said. The room went silent. Some gasped. Some shook their heads in disbelief. One woman even laughed, thinking it was a joke. But then they read the documents. They saw the signatures. And the color drained from their faces. I leaned back in my chair, folded my arms, and said, "So about those fines, consider them cancelled." The president stammered, his face redder than I'd ever seen. He tried to argue, tried to twist his words, but nothing came out right. For the first time, he wasn't in control. I was. And that's when the tables turned. Because it wasn't just about canceling my fines anymore. No. I had power now. Real power. The kind the HOA could never take back. The very next week, I sent them my own notice. Effective immediately, all HOA board members are banned from using the lake. No fishing. No swimming. No boating. No exceptions. The rage in their faces when they read it. I'll never forget it. The same people who tried to ruin me were now standing at the edge of the water, powerless, staring at the lake they once controlled but could no longer touch. My neighbors? Oh, they were stunned. Some of them cheered for me. Some kept their distance. But everyone knew one thing: the balance of power had shifted forever. I wasn't the man being fined anymore. I was the man who owned the water beneath their docks. That night, I sat on my yacht, waves gently rocking beneath me, and thought about everything that had happened. The laughter, the anger, the meetings, the paperwork, the stress. It had all led to this. And as I looked out across the lake, the same lake that now belonged to me, I realized something. Sometimes, when someone pushes you too far, the best revenge isn't fighting back with equal force. The best revenge is taking away the very thing they thought they controlled. And now let me ask you something. If you had the chance to flip the script on your HOA, to take away the very power they used against you, would you do it? Or would you walk away and keep the peace? Tell me in the comments, because I wonder how many of you would have done exactly what I did. When word spread that I had bought the lake, the whole neighborhood changed overnight. People who never spoke to me before suddenly stopped by to congratulate me. Some smiled and shook my hand, telling me I had done what everyone else only dreamed of. Others, though, they whispered behind my back, wondering if I had gone too far. But the loudest reaction came from the HOA board. The president stormed down to my dock one evening, red in the face, his voice sharp as a blade. "You think this gives you power?" he barked. "You can't run this community. You're just one man with a piece of paper." I didn't move. I just leaned against the railing, arms crossed, calm as the water behind me. "One man with a piece of paper," I said, "who owns the water under your boats. Think about that." He clenched his fists, his jaw tight, but he had no answer. He turned and walked away, but I knew that wasn't the end. Because men like him don't let go of power easily. And I was right. The HOA doubled down. They called emergency meetings. They tried to convince neighbors that I was dangerous, reckless, a threat to community order. Flyers showed up in mailboxes with my name in bold letters, accusing me of ruining property values and abusing authority. At first, I laughed it off. But soon, I started noticing strange things. One morning, the tires on my truck were slashed. Another evening, I found eggs splattered across my front door. Neighbors who used to wave started looking the other way. It was clear, the board was fighting dirty. But I wasn't going to be intimidated. So I did something that made their blood boil even hotter. I held a lake party. Yes, a full-blown Independence Day celebration. Fireworks, music, food, kids swimming, families laughing. I invited everyone except the HOA board. And when the night sky lit up with red, white, and blue, the board members stood at the edge of the street, powerless, watching the water they couldn't touch. That was the moment everything shifted. Because suddenly, the community saw the truth. The HOA wasn't protecting them. The HOA wasn't making life better. The HOA was just a handful of bullies clinging to power they no longer had. People started coming to me privately. "We support you," they whispered. "We're tired of their rules." Some even offered to help pay for lake maintenance. For the first time in years, neighbors weren't afraid to stand up. But the president, oh, he couldn't take it. A week later, I got a letter taped to my door. Not an HOA letter this time, but a lawsuit. The HOA was suing me. They claimed I was abusing my ownership, that I was violating community spirit, and that I was discriminating against the board by banning them from the lake. I laughed when I read it, but deep down, I knew this was serious. They weren't just sending fines anymore. They were dragging me into court. And so began the ugliest battle of my life. Lawyers, hearings, hours in courtrooms filled with neighbors whispering in the back. The HOA argued that the lake was community property by tradition. My lawyer argued that tradition doesn't mean ownership. I had the deed, the signatures, the law on my side. But the board wouldn't stop. They brought witnesses. They twisted words. They painted me as a selfish old man trying to punish everyone. And I'll admit, there were nights I sat awake, wondering if I had made a mistake. But then, one morning, something happened that gave me strength again. I walked outside to grab my paper and found a small note under my doormat. No name. Just a handwritten line that said, "Thank you for standing up to them. You're not alone." It wasn't much. But it reminded me why I was fighting. And the fight dragged on, weeks turned into months. Every court date was another storm. The board would glare at me across the room, their lawyer spitting fire, but I never looked away. Then came the final hearing. The judge listened carefully, flipping through documents, asking sharp questions. At the end, he set the papers down, leaned forward, and said, "The ownership of the lake is clear. It belongs to the defendant. The HOA has no authority over it." The room exploded in whispers. The president's face turned pale. His jaw dropped, and for once, he had no words. I walked out of that courtroom a free man. No fines. No bans. No board breathing down my neck. And when I got back to the lake that night, the water looked different. It looked brighter. Freer. Like it belonged to me in more ways than just a deed. The HOA tried to bury me, but all they did was dig their own grave. I leaned on the railing, felt the breeze on my face, and thought about everything I'd been through. The letters. The threats. The lawsuit. And how, in the end, it all came down to one truth. Bullies can only win if you let them. Now I'll ask you something, friend. If your HOA dragged you into court, tried to ruin your reputation, and made you fight for something that was rightfully yours, would you have the courage to keep going, or would you give up to keep the peace? I really want to hear your thoughts, drop them down in the comments. After that courtroom victory, you'd think the war was over, but when it comes to HOAs, nothing is ever that simple. For a few weeks, things were quiet. No letters in the mailbox. No angry knocks on my door. No cops showing up at my dock. It felt peaceful. Almost too peaceful. And I was right. Because peace doesn't last long when people like the HOA president are still around. One evening, I was sitting out on the deck of my yacht, watching the sun drop low behind the trees. The sky was orange, the water calm. That's when I noticed something strange. Across the lake, near the community dock, a group of people had gathered. I saw clipboards. I saw neighbors whispering, pointing. And right there, standing tall in the middle, was the HOA president. He wasn't done with me. He was plotting. The very next morning, I found new flyers on every doorstep. In bold letters, they read, "Save our community. Remove the tyrant who stole our lake." I stood there on my porch, reading those words, my blood boiling. Tyrant? Me? I wasn't the one handing out fines like candy. I wasn't the one calling the police on neighbors. But now they were painting me as the villain. And here's the thing about lies, if you repeat them loud enough, people start to believe them. Some neighbors who once supported me now looked at me with suspicion. A few even confronted me, saying, "Maybe you went too far." I wanted to shout back, "Too far." They tried to ruin me first. But I knew shouting wouldn't fix anything. So instead, I decided to act. I called for a community meeting. Not an HOA meeting, but my meeting. On the dock. Right by the lake that I now owned. Word spread fast. By the evening, nearly the whole neighborhood showed up. Some came curious, some came angry, some came just to watch the drama. And of course, the HOA board showed up too, standing off to the side with their arms crossed, scowling. I stood on the dock, cleared my throat, and spoke from the heart. I didn't buy this lake to punish anyone. I bought it because I was pushed too far. Because I was fined, threatened, and harassed in my own home. All of you know what it feels like when the HOA goes too far. This wasn't about revenge. This was about freedom. People murmured. Heads nodded. But then the president shouted, "Freedom? You banned us. You embarrassed us. You turned this community into a circus." I looked him dead in the eye and said, "I banned you, not the community. Because you abused your power. And if you're embarrassed, maybe you should ask yourself why." The crowd went silent. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker across some of their faces. And that's when I made a decision that shocked everyone. I announced a new rule. The lake is open to every neighbor who respects it. Families can swim, fish, and boat like always. But the HOA board, the people who tried to destroy me, are no longer welcome. Gasps spread through the crowd. Some smiled. Some frowned. The board members turned red with rage. But I stood firm. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about showing everyone that bullies don't win. Of course, the HOA didn't take this lying down. Over the next few weeks, they tried everything. They called more lawyers. They filed complaints with the county. They even spread rumors that my ownership wasn't legal. But each time, the truth stood stronger than their lies. The deed was mine. The lake was mine. And no amount of shouting could change that. But the real victory wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the way the neighborhood slowly started to change. Families began coming to the lake again. Kids laughed and splashed in the water. Parents set up chairs on the shore. For the first time in years, the lake felt alive again, not as a weapon for control, but as a place for joy. And every time I sat on my yacht, watching kids chase each other in the shallows, I felt a satisfaction I can't put into words. The HOA tried to tear me down, but instead, I gave the lake back to the people who loved it. Still, I could see the hatred burning in the president's eyes. One night, I caught him standing at the edge of the dock, staring out over the water like it had been stolen from him. His fists were clenched, his shoulders tight. He didn't say a word. Just stared. And in that silence, I realized something. This wasn't over for him. He was planning something. And I had no idea how far he was willing to go. So let me ask you this. If you were in my shoes, and the HOA kept coming at you even after you won, would you keep pushing back, or would you finally try to make peace with them? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm curious which side you'd take. I should have known the HOA president wouldn't stop at glares and whispers. One night, just after midnight, I was woken by a loud bang. At first, I thought it was thunder, but then I smelled smoke. I ran outside and saw flames flickering at the edge of my dock. Someone had set fire to a pile of old wood stacked nearby. My heart raced. I grabbed the hose and started spraying until the fire went out. Luckily, it hadn't reached the yacht, but the message was clear. This wasn't random. This was a warning. The next morning, I checked my security cameras. Sure enough, the blurry figure of a man crept across my property just before the fire started. I couldn't prove it was the president, but deep down, I knew. And that's when I realized, this fight had gone from rules and fines to something darker. But if he thought I would back down, he was wrong. So I did something bold. I installed bigger lights around the dock, security cameras on every corner, and even a sign that said, "Lake under new ownership. Trespassers will be prosecuted." The president saw it the next day, and oh, the look on his face. He exploded. He marched right up to me while I was mowing my lawn and shouted, "You think this lake is your kingdom? You won't last. The whole neighborhood is turning against you." I shut off the mower, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "You already lost. You just don't know it yet." He stormed off, but I could feel his hatred like a weight in the air. A week later, I got another knock on my door. This time, it wasn't the HOA, it was county officials. Complaints had been filed about unsafe conditions on the lake. I invited them in, showed them the property, the paperwork, the maintenance I had already done. They found nothing wrong. The complaints were empty. But I knew exactly who had filed them. The president was trying every trick in the book to make my life miserable. And yet, something strange was happening. While he got angrier, my neighbors got friendlier. More and more of them began coming to me quietly, telling me how tired they were of the HOA's bullying. Some admitted they had been fined for silly reasons too: a lawn too long, a mailbox the wrong color, a flower bed that didn't match community standards. For years, they had stayed silent out of fear. But now, they had someone standing up to the board. Someone showing them it was possible to fight back. And that gave me an idea. What if I didn't just own the lake? What if I took the HOA down completely? I knew it wouldn't be easy. HOAs run on fear and paperwork. But if enough neighbors joined me, if enough people stood up, we could strip them of their power. So I started talking to people. On walks. At the store. By the dock. I told them my story, reminded them of theirs, and slowly, the tide began to turn. By the end of the month, I had a group of families ready to fight. Not just for me, but for themselves. We organized a petition to recall the HOA board. We went door to door, collecting signatures, explaining how the HOA had abused its power, wasted money, and harassed homeowners for years. The president caught wind of it, of course. He showed up at one house while I was still inside, waving his arms and shouting at me to stop. The homeowner told him to leave. That's when I knew he was losing control. Finally, the day came when we had enough signatures to force a recall vote. The meeting was packed. Every seat filled, neighbors standing along the walls, whispering, waiting. The board sat stiff at the front, their faces pale. And me? I sat in the middle row, calm, quiet, watching it all unfold. The president stood up and started his usual speech about community values and respecting authority. But this time, no one clapped. No one nodded. The silence was heavier than any shout. Then the petition was read aloud. The signatures were counted. And the vote began. One by one, neighbors stood, raised their hands, and voted to remove the board. And when the final count was called, the result was clear. The HOA board was gone. The president's face turned ghost white. He stood there frozen, fists clenched, eyes darting around the room like he couldn't believe it. But it was real. His reign of fear had ended. I walked out of that room feeling lighter than I had in years. Not just because I had one, but because we had all one. The whole community. That night, sitting on my yacht, I looked out at the lake and thought about everything that had happened. From the first fine in the mailbox, to the courtroom battles, to the fire at my dock, to this moment of victory. And I realized something important. Sometimes, standing up for yourself isn't just about you. Sometimes, it's about giving others the courage to stand up too. And that felt better than any victory I'd ever had. But let me ask you, friend. If your neighborhood gave you the chance to vote your HOA out forever, would you raise your hand and fight for freedom, or would you keep quiet and hope someone else does it for you? I'd love to know your answer. Drop it in the comments. The night after the HOA was voted out, I thought it was over. I thought I could finally sleep without looking over my shoulder, without checking the dock every hour, without wondering what kind of letter or trick would come next. But peace never comes easy when someone like the old president still has his pride. It started small. I noticed him driving by my house more often, slower than usual, his headlights lingering just a little too long on my driveway. Then, a few neighbors told me they'd seen him whispering to anyone who would listen, trying to stir anger, trying to convince them that removing the HOA was a mistake. And then one night, he came back to the dock. I was sitting on the yacht, enjoying the cool breeze, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was, standing with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his face half in shadow. "You think you won," he said quietly. "But this neighborhood will regret following you." I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes on him. "No," I said. "What they'll regret is following you for so long." His eyes narrowed. For a moment, I thought he might lunge at me, but instead, he smirked, turned, and walked away. It should have ended there. But I knew, men like him don't let go. A week later, I got a letter in the mail. Not from the HOA. Not even from the county. This time, it was from a private law firm. He had filed a personal lawsuit against me. The claim? That my ownership of the lake was illegitimate, that I had tricked the company into selling, and that the lake should be returned to the community. When I showed the letter to my lawyer, he shook his head and chuckled. "This won't hold up," he said. "He's desperate. But desperate people can still do damage." And sure enough, the lawsuit dragged me right back into court. The hearings were ugly. He stood there, red-faced, spitting out accusations, painting me as some greedy man who had stolen the lake from his neighbors. He brought in people to testify against me, neighbors who had been scared into believing his lies. But for every person he convinced, I had two standing with me. People who had been fined for silly reasons. Families who had been bullied. Homeowners who had lost sleep under his reign. They stood up and told their stories, and one by one, the truth outweighed the lies. Still, the stress was heavy. There were nights I sat awake in my chair, staring out the window at the moonlit lake, wondering if I had made a mistake. Was it worth it? Was all this fighting worth the sleepless nights, the courtrooms, the endless anger from one bitter man? But every time I asked myself that, I thought of the kids laughing on the dock. The families fishing together at sunset. The neighbors who finally felt free. And I knew the answer. Yes. It was worth it. The lawsuit dragged on for months. Papers filed, hearings delayed, lawyers arguing over technicalities. The president looked more exhausted every time I saw him. His voice grew hoarse. His arguments grew weaker. He wasn't fighting for justice anymore, he was fighting for his ego. Finally, the judge gave his decision. The deed is valid. The sale is legitimate. The plaintiff has no claim. Case dismissed. The gavel came down. It was over. I walked out of that courtroom with a weight lifted from my shoulders. Neighbors shook my hand, patted my back, told me I had done what no one else would. And the president? He slumped in his chair, eyes blank, like the fight had finally left him. But victory didn't feel like revenge anymore. It felt like closure. Because now, the lake wasn't just mine. It was safe. It was free. It was untouchable. That night, as the sun set over the water, I sat on my yacht with a glass in my hand and thought about everything we'd been through. From that first violation letter, to the police at my dock, to the flames in the night, to the courtroom battles, and now this final victory. The lake glowed in the fading light, the water calm and endless, and I realized something I hadn't before. It was never really about the yacht. It was never really about the fines. It was about standing up when no one else would. It was about showing that one person can turn the tide when the whole community feels trapped. And maybe, just maybe, it was about giving the next homeowner, the next neighbor, the next family the courage to say, enough. The HOA thought they could scare me. They thought they could break me. But in the end, all they did was give me the fight of my life. And I won. Now let me ask you something. If you had the chance to not only win against your HOA, but to make sure they could never hurt your neighbors again, would you take it? Or would you walk away once you saved yourself? I'd love to hear your thoughts, drop them in the comments below. When the dust finally settled, when the last gavel struck and the last paper was signed, I thought about everything that had happened. The HOA fines, the police on my dock, the fire in the night, the courtroom battles, the whispers from neighbors who were too afraid to speak out. All of it, all of that chaos, had led me here. Here I was, standing on the edge of the dock, looking out at a lake that no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt peaceful again. The water was still. Families were back to fishing, kids were laughing and splashing near the shore, couples were taking small boats out in the evenings. The lake was alive again, not with fear, not with control, but with freedom. I leaned against the railing and breathed deep. The smell of water, the sound of ripples, the laughter echoing in the distance, it felt like a weight I'd carried for too long had finally been lifted. The HOA had tried to crush me. They had thrown every weapon they had: fines, threats, lawsuits, even fear itself. And in the end, all they did was make me stronger. Because here's the truth I learned through it all. Power doesn't come from titles. It doesn't come from a board or a rule book. Power comes from standing your ground when you know you're right. And that's exactly what I did. One evening, I saw the old president standing far off on the other side of the lake. He wasn't shouting this time. He wasn't waving his fists. He just stood there quietly, watching the water. His shoulders were slumped, his face tired. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because he had every chance to do the right thing. He could have chosen fairness. He could have chosen community. But instead, he chose control. He chose fear. And in the end, fear always loses. I turned away from him and walked back onto my yacht. I sat down, looked up at the flag I had hung proudly from the mast, and smiled. It wasn't just a yacht anymore. It wasn't just a lake anymore. It was a symbol. A reminder that no matter how strong the bullies seem, they only win if you let them. And the best part? My neighbors finally saw it too. The same people who once looked down when the HOA walked by now waved at me across the water. They stopped me on the street to say thank you. Some even admitted they wished they had stood up sooner. One older gentleman, a neighbor I barely knew, came up to me after a long walk by the lake. He shook my hand firmly and said, "You gave us our home back." Those 6 words, they meant more to me than anything. Because that's what it felt like. For years, the HOA had made this neighborhood feel like a prison of petty rules. Now, it finally felt like a home again. The seasons changed. Summer turned to fall. The trees around the lake lit up in gold and red, their reflections dancing on the water. And every time I stepped onto the dock, every time I took the yacht out, I was reminded of the battle we had fought. And the victory we had earned. Not just me. All of us. Because this wasn't just about a yacht. It wasn't even about the lake. It was about freedom. It was about dignity. It was about showing that no matter your age, no matter how much power is stacked against you, you still have a voice. And sometimes, one voice is enough to change everything. I still remember that first letter. That first fine. How small it made me feel. How powerless. And yet, here I was, standing stronger than ever. And I thought to myself, maybe that's the real lesson. The HOA thought they were punishing me. But really, they gave me the greatest gift. They gave me the chance to fight. They gave me the chance to prove that even one person can stand tall against a machine built on fear. They gave me the chance to remind everyone that freedom is worth fighting for. So now, when I sit out on the yacht at night, the water calm and the stars shining above, I don't feel anger anymore. I don't feel bitterness. I just feel proud. Proud of the battle. Proud of the scars. Proud of the lake that now belongs to me, and to every neighbor who chooses to live free. The HOA is gone. The lake is mine. And peace, real peace, has finally returned. And as I sip my coffee in the morning, watching the sun rise over the water, I can't help but smile and think. All of this started with one letter in the mailbox. One letter that was supposed to break me. But instead, it made me stronger than I ever thought I could be. Now let me leave you with this. If someone tried to take away your freedom, your dignity, your peace, would you let them? Or would you stand tall, even if you had to stand alone? I want to hear your answer. Tell me in the comments.